Greetings to all. Welcome to CEC lecture. The topic of analysis for the lecture is Visual Turn in IR Films. In this lecture, we shall explain the importance of studying the narrative of IR through the visual framework. This lecture shall also discuss importance as well as challenges in situating issues of international relations through the films. This lecture shall elaborate on how films add to research and analytical information quotient in the discipline. Film, also called in the popular parlance movie, motion picture, moving picture, photoplay. Film is a work of visual art that simulates experiences and otherwise communicates ideas, stories, perceptions, feelings. Films enact a story by sound and a sequence of images, giving the illusion of continuous movement. Robert Altman said, "Filmmaking is a chance to live many lifetimes." Peter Jackson had said, "The most honest form of filmmaking is to make a film for yourself." Now with this, let us understand the visual turn in IR with respect to films. Michel quoted in his work, and we present from there, images in international relations have become increasingly important, regardless of whether one believes in the dawn of the pictorial turn. So it is very essential to understand how important images have become in IR. To this, the work of Robert Gregg pointed out, and we quote from there, that what could be utility of movies and films when we try to look at IR. Movies and films help students learn and enhance their knowledge about international politics as they constitute a window on the world. Now with this, let's understand the problems and challenges of teaching IR with respect to the movies. To begin with, let us first understand that IR as a discipline was first dominated by the realist paradigm. The realism, the first IR debate, namely the realist versus the idealist debate, there was a debate with respect to how to and in which manner one should understand the discipline. The realism focused on the conflictual aspect of international reality. The 3 S of realism, namely statism, self-help, survival. And in contrast to that, the idealist perspective tried to present the cooperative side of international reality, with the focus towards important role the morals and the ideals and institutions can play in international relations. What we see here is that realism, though it remained the dominant narrative, but with time it witnessed the presence of other perspectives, namely it witnessed the neo-neo debate, where both neo-realism, which has a refined form of realism often called as structural realism, the neo-neo debate, if we see, wherein neo-realism and neoliberalism are being debated. Now herein in this debate, we get very important sense, namely that state is no doubt an important actor, but at the same time, one cannot ignore the importance of non-state actors, ranging from market, from industry, amongst others. So therefore, one also needs to understand that yes, realism, neo-realism attempted to see international relations with the relative gains framework, that is, gains were seen with respect to relative sense. But at the same time, what neoliberalism highlighted, that gains can be seen in the absolute gain sense too, namely where ecology, economic development are equally important. What one sees here is that the end of the Cold War definitely presented new issues with respect to theory and practice of international relations. One finds that there is a movement away from rational perspective, moving towards a reflectivist perspective, which pointed out the significance of human agency, individual experiences. And herein, with this reflectivist perspective, one finds that feminism, environmentalism, critical study, critical security studies all become important agenda. In sustainable development, that is development which meets the needs of the present without compromising on the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. This important definition of sustainable development was given by the Brundtland Commission in its report, Our Common Future 1987. Now, as we point out about this report, that is Our Common Future 1987, it is very important to understand that at this point there is rethinking of international relations agenda. That is, IR can no longer be studied with respect to the issues from the realist perspective. There is more that is there in the agenda to study IR, that is, environment is an equally important issue. So, similarly, when we are talking about environment earlier was not given a due place when there was discussion about high politics area of IR. But with time, environment, ecology, climate change, global warming, greenhouse effect, loss of biodiversity, all of these environmental issues are important part of diplomatic relations. They are important in the agenda for understanding international global governance. Three core elements of sustainable development, as we all know: economic growth, social inclusion, environmental protection. So what we see here is today, when we look at tackling climate change, biodiversity loss, fostering sustainable development, they are mutually reinforcing issues. So with this, we present you the important documentary, and that's where we bring the focus toward that how the visual turn in IR, therein the films are having an important role. Leonardo DiCaprio with the important documentary Before the Flood. Leonardo DiCaprio, the famous actor, important remarks to the United Nations in 2014, that is, you are the last best hope of earth. We ask you to protect it, or we and all living things we cherish are history. That further, another important quote as we discuss the documentary Before the Flood, and the quote is from Leonardo DiCaprio, the actor, while addressing the United Nations in 2014. The time to answer the greatest challenge of our existence on this planet is now. You can make history or be vilified by it. So what we see here is that how the documentary, the very famous documentary Before the Flood, presented important issues concerning global governance through the medium of the films. And yes, important inputs presented in the narrative of the film. They further present important ideas for research, narrative for debate. Further, quoting from the remarks of Leonardo DiCaprio to the audience at the 2015 Global Citizen Festival, that is, we are running out of time, and it is now incumbent upon all of us, all of you, activists, young and old, to please get involved. Quoting further, because the environment and the fight for the world's poor are inherently linked. The planet can no longer wait. The underprivileged can no longer be ignored. This is truly our moment for action. Please take action. So what we see here is that environment, such an important concern, that is today when we look at climate change, biodiversity loss, fostering sustainable development, and all these issues are important with respect to global governance narrative. So seen in this scenario, what we see here is that the visual turn in IR, where we look at films like what we just discussed, the important film Before the Flood. This documentary presented important issues that we all must reflect on, And all of this recorded aspect further is an important issue with respect to global governance narrative. Moving forward, as you all know that today the contours of security in international relations have been redefined. As we were just discussing the neo debate, looking at the further, taking things further with the rational versus reflectivist turn, we have to understand that today security is multidimensional. Of course, state is an important actor in international relations, and military security is always sacred. But at the same time, economic security, at the same time, health security cannot be ignored. So, the world witnessed a pandemic, and the pandemic really led to rethinking also over the nature of warfare. That is, earlier warfare was more direct. Now, pandemic presented important case studies, research inputs with respect to biowarfare. Pandemic is different from an epidemic. Let us clarify that. According to the World Health Organization, a pandemic is declared when a new disease for which people do not have immunity spreads around the world beyond expectations. Epidemic, on the other hand, an epidemic is a large outbreak, one that spreads amongst a population or region. It is less severe, like when you try to compare and contrast pandemic and epidemic, dear learners, we have to understand that it is less severe than pandemic due to limited area of spread. Now, the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem, this report is verily available. IPBES has recently released a report which warns about future pandemic. For the benefit of our learners, we would like to tell everyone that Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem, IPBES, it is an independent intergovernmental body established by United Nations in 2012. This body aims to strengthen the science policy interface for biodiversity and ecosystem services for the conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity, long-term human well-being and sustainable development. Now, this report pointed out, the recent report pointed out that COVID-19 is at least the sixth pandemic roughly if we trace to have taken place in the last century since the Spanish influenza pandemic of 1918. In March 2020, further, the World Health Organization declared COVID-19 as a pandemic. 3 of the pandemics earlier were caused by influenza viruses, one by human immunodeficiency virus, HIV, followed by severe acute respiratory syndrome, SARS, and then now the COVID-19. Now, as we further go into the important inputs from the debate, that is when we look at the causes, almost all the pandemics so far have been, because of zoonosis, that is diseases caused by germs that spread between animals and people. More than 70% of emerging diseases such as Ebola, Zika, Nipah are caused by microbes found in animals which spread due to contact amongst livestock and people. What we see here is that as we are discussing pandemic, and today pandemic is an important research issue. Today pandemic discussions are very important for global diplomatic summits and occasions. Let us now understand that how the visual turn in IR, looking at films wherein there have been attempts to understand issues, there have been attempts to reflect on issues of IR through the pictures, through the films. That is, to give you an example here, to take the discussion forward with an example, Outbreak. Outbreak, dear learners, it's a 1995 American medical disaster film. Outbreak has been directed by Wolfgang Petersen, and it has been based on Richard Peterson's 1994 non-fiction book, The Hot Zone. Now, let's understand what was the outbreak talking about. In the movie Outbreak, it is shown that when a deadly virus, and this we are talking about 1995, right? At that time, there was no COVID pandemic. But yes, the movie presented an important audio-visual pictorial image representation, a depiction, that is how do we deal with issues of IR, that when a deadly virus carried by a monkey host from the African rainforest starts infecting the entire population, a handful of scientists struggle to find a cure. So what we see here is that the situation, what outbreak pointed out, somewhere today when we look at how pandemics and when how today reports are pointing out, namely as we just reflected on the IPBES, they released the recent report which warns about future pandemics. So movies like Outbreak already have discussed it. Further, to take the discussion forward on the visual turn in IR, looking at films, another important film which depicted an important agenda of international relations, Contagion. Contagion is 2011 American medical scientist thriller, film directed by Steven Soderbergh. Now, when we try to understand Contagion, the plot of the movie concerned the spread of a virus. It was concerned about the spread of a virus transmitted by respiratory droplets and fomites. So the important message that Contagion presented, that is with respect to looking at faith, hope, grit, sense of community. So therefore what we see that when we look at visual aspect in IR, films have played an important role, right from the issues concerning ecological issues, the need for important human action. The documentary Before the Flood has talked about it. So right from understanding to important issues of the pandemic, outbreak to Contagion has addressed it. Let's understand some important research inputs as we are debating visual turn in IR films. The important work by Sean Carter, International Politics and Film, Space, Vision, Power. This book is from Columbia University Press, 2014. In this book, there has been an attempt made to understand the relation between the visual and the spatial. And it is very essential, as the book points out, that when we are looking at the space, the vision, the power, all of it is constitutive of international politics. Further, as the book points out, borders, the state of exception, homeland and distant others, the territorial and the imaginative dimensions of international relations in particular are very aptly highlighted in this book, that is talking about that is the spatial issues and the visual depiction of that is an important constituent of international politics. International politics is not just something about out there, as the work points out by Sean Carter, that is the films, as we are debating the visual turn in IR. The films helps us to understand better, helps us better understand how it is also part of everyday life within the state, in different individuals and communities, in different ways, and depending on the different axes of difference from gender to ethnicity. So what we see here is that international politics has been given a very internalized, a very personal depiction. It's just not, this is what Sean Carter's important argument is. Sean Carter talking about that international politics is not just something out there. Films help us to understand better how it is also part of everyday life within the state. Another important work that we must take into account, Joel R. Campbell's and Gigi Goksok's work, The Final Frontier, International Relations and Politics Through Star Trek and Star Wars. This important work from Rauman and Littlefield, that is, it looks into importance of science fiction, how science fiction can play an important role not only with respect to literature, film and television, but also how science fiction can point out towards tensions. An example of that, the ideological tensions that were there at the time of Cold War, or for that matter, how technology has become an important pillar with respect to power dynamics. So the book looks into development of Star Trek, Star Wars franchises and discusses how their progression through time has been illustrated, how it has defined and redefined important theories, important concepts in international relations. Another important work by Sophie Harman, that is Seeing Politics, Film, Visual Method and International Relations. Sophie Harman's work points out that visual politics and the aesthetics turn in international relations have emphasized on the power of image in world politics. We have to understand that we are living in the digital age. We have to understand that today internet communications technology play an important role. And in that aspect, to define the narrative of the discipline, the power of the image is important too. And this is what Sophie Harman's work, Seeing Politics, Film, Visual Method and International Relations point out, that is visual politics and the aesthetics turn in international relations. It is important to emphasize on the power of image. So through a detailed exploration of political process of film production, that's very important, that how film production has been looked through a very deeper lens, that is from inception to co-production to distribution to exhibition. So therefore, with respect to understanding transnational relations, government gatekeeping, hierarchies of film governance, that is what are the important issues that one needs to understand with respect to control or marginalizing the stories people see. So therefore, in Seeing Politics, the important argument, the research argument that has been put forward, how narrative feature film challenges and advances discipline of international relations, revealing aspects of politics that would otherwise remain unseen and unaddressed. Further, Seeing Politics also impresses upon an important fact that film is not only just a way of communicating research. One has to look at films in a bigger framework, in a bigger canvas. It is a method that produces research. It is a method that leads to visibility, advances research practice, and most important, films have a very important role with respect to dissemination of knowledge, availability of information in international relations. Further, so it is very important to look at these innovative and compelling dimensions that the visual turn in IR is presenting through films. In this book, The Seeing Politics, through a detailed exploration of the political process of film production, important inputs are there and that one must take into account. So dear learners, it is very important for all of us to understand that IR is a very important discipline, and in IR, the agenda of research, the agenda of discourse has always witnessed changes. What one finds that the discipline that begins with the dominance of realism, with time, with the end of Cold War, witnesses new perspective, witnesses new insights from rationality to reflectivism. One also finds that in understanding of narrative of IR in the contemporary times, visual framework is playing an important role. When we situate issues of IR through the lens of the films, we get the sense that today communication, perceptions, feelings, stories, ideas, all of them are impacted by rampantly rise and innovation of information and communication technology. So therefore, images have become important, so are films. Films are not only about presentation, but they have a deeper meaning, namely about knowledge, namely about it is an important window, it's an important framework, as Robert Gregg says, on the world. So when we try to understand IR through films, no doubt it has challenges. For example, when we understand issues like sustainable development can be better understood by looking at documentaries like Before the Flood. Issues of climate change, biodiversity, global warming are aptly highlighted by looking at important depiction in the documentary Before the Flood, talking about that there is a need for all of us to safeguard our existence on this planet. Further, today IR is witnessing new forms of security threats. Today, when security is no longer seen in traditional sense, non-traditional security threats like from pandemic to technology to ecology, films have therein also playing an important role. For example, outbreak, for example, the work of Contagion, how it points out that there is a need to look at the important message, the significance of the visual turn in IR through the films. But however, while understanding the relation between the visual and the spatial, which is no doubt an important part of international politics, one also has to look at not only the opportunities but also factor in the important challenges that are here. Visual politics, aesthetics turn, no doubt are important, but one must also delve deeper into the message the film presents with respect to research, visibility, knowledge in order to make the study more innovative. Dear learners, we hope that the lecture on visual turn in IR films presented to you significant inputs and insights. We look forward to positive, encouraging feedback from you all. Thank you very much.